from a tiger shark attacking an Instagram model after she'd already been told the session was over, to a Las Vegas bartender who ran past warning flags on a $20 dare and never made it back to shore. Hi, I'm Jaxon. Today, we're looking at 6 shark attack stories. And we're starting in Western Australia, where a tiger shark came up through a chum trail and struck a 25-year-old Instagram model during a photo shoot. It was July 16, 2017, off a remote reef system in Western Australia, and the water had the kind of visibility that makes people stay longer than they should, around 50 feet of clean blue clarity, far enough from the mainland that the reef still felt untouched. And the afternoon light was doing exactly what afternoon light off the Western Australian coast does best. That detail was the whole reason she was there. Sienna Vale was 25, originally from Arizona, and had spent 3 years building a following on Instagram through one specific formula: stunning locations, minimal clothing, and a camera that knew exactly how to make both work together. She wasn't a travel journalist or an adventure creator. She was a lifestyle model who understood that the ocean was her best backdrop and that the more dramatic the setting, the more the image performed. By 2017, she had hundreds of thousands of followers and a content schedule built entirely around chasing that next shot. The one that stopped the scroll, the one that got saved and shared and talked about. She wasn't careless in the obvious ways. She researched locations, hired photographers, coordinated shoots down to the light angle and tide timing, but she had a consistent habit of pushing past the agreed plan once the safe version stopped producing the image she had already built in her head. Risk, to Sienna, was something a good location scout and the right timing could manage. She had chartered a converted fishing vessel out of a small coastal town, using a private cage diving setup run by 2 freelance guides catering to tourists wanting something outside the standard circuit. Investigators later said they could not locate any permit or licensing documentation tied to the charter. The morning session went as planned. Cage in, bait in, sharks on schedule. Her photographer shot from the boat while Sienna posed at the cage entrance in open water. Bikini, clear water, sharks visible in the background. Clean content. The guide said the session was done, but the overhead angle was missing, and the light was still perfect. What she wanted, and what the morning footage hadn't given her, was a drone shot from directly above. Her body at the surface, sharks moving beneath her, everything symmetrical and visible from above. The kind of image that doesn't just stop a scroll. It gets screenshotted, reposted, and talked about for weeks. She asked for one more run. The guides agreed. Fish scraps went back into the water. Sienna entered without the cage this time, in a white swimsuit, positioning herself near the surface while the drone lifted overhead. Tiger sharks appear frequently in coastal attack data for one specific reason. They don't retreat from unfamiliar stimuli. They investigate. Large adults exceed 14 feet and over 1,000 pounds. In chum-active water, a figure floating motionless at the surface presents exactly the silhouette that triggers an investigative approach from below. From that angle, a shark running a threat assessment doesn't see a person. It sees shape, movement, and signals. The drone kept recording. The water stayed calm. Then a tiger shark that had been circling beneath the boat surged upward in a committed strike, hitting Sienna at the neck and upper head with enough force to pull her partially beneath the surface before the crew could react. What followed happened in seconds. The crew pulled her out while the shark churned the water below. Emergency services were contacted from 18 miles offshore. The drone battery died before the vessel reached shore. Sienna wasn't careless. She was ambitious in the way that had always worked for her before. She understood risk. She prepared. She hired guides, but the perfect shot had slowly become more important than knowing when to stop. The same instinct that built her career is what put her back in that water one last time. The 2 guides stopped operating after the incident. Despite everything the case brought to light, no permit or licensing documentation was ever found. That is how Sienna Vale lost her life, by trusting an unlicensed operation and going back in for one last shot. Our next character met his end for a very different reason. He trusted his own experience and stepped into the wrong water, thinking 20 years of knowledge would protect him. It was August 3rd, 2015, and the Gulf of Mexico off the Louisiana coast had that specific quality it gets in deep summer. Heavy, warm, completely still. The kind of heat that sits on the surface and refuses to move. 2 miles out, near the rusted skeleton of an abandoned oil platform that locals had been quietly avoiding for years, 3 men on rented jet skis were doing exactly what Marcus Holloway had decided they were going to do, which was fish. Marcus Holloway was 34, a construction foreman from outside Baton Rouge who had been fishing the Gulf since he was old enough to hold a rod over the side of his uncle's boat. He was the loudest person in most rooms he walked into, not in the way that clears a room, but in the way that means the room organized itself around whatever he's decided. On job sites, that quality moved concrete and made deadlines. Out on the water with two friends and a cooler making serious inroads since early morning, it meant that when Marcus pointed toward the platform, nobody offered an alternative. The platform had a reputation among people who knew that stretch of water, not a formal, sign-posted reputation, just the kind that passes between people who spend real time on the Gulf. Locals didn't fish there. Marcus had heard some version of this. He had also fished the Gulf for 20 years without seeing anything that justified the warning. In his working logic, 2 decades of personal experience outweighed second-hand caution from people who probably hadn't been out there themselves. They anchored alongside the structure and spent an hour cutting bait and dropping fish waste into the water, a sustained introduction of blood and biological material into warm, slow-moving Gulf water that carries scent a long way. Then, Marcus's jet ski started stalling. Monofilament fishing line had wrapped around the intake grate and choked the propulsion system down. Fixable. The fix required someone to get into the water and work the line free by hand, and Marcus Holloway was not the kind of man who asked someone else to handle something he could handle himself. He went in. Before this moves further, it's worth understanding what bull sharks actually are, because the Gulf of Mexico in summer, in warm, murky water near a fixed structure, is about as concentrated a bull shark environment as exists anywhere. Bull sharks are the only major species that move freely between saltwater and freshwater, pushing into shallow coastal zones that most large sharks cannot reach. They are heavy, thick-bodied animals built for explosive bursts of force. Adults average around 9 feet, with bite forces exceeding 1,300 pounds per square inch. In shallow environments with active chum present, they don't circle and assess. They respond to splash, to struggling movement, to the signal that something nearby is vulnerable. The water around that platform had been receiving an hour of cut bait. Marcus was now waist-deep in it, hands on the intake grate, back turned to open water. His friend said there was almost no warning. One moment Marcus was working at the grate. The next, the water went red in a way that takes the brain a full second to process. The bull shark struck from below and behind, removing most of his left leg above the knee in a single pass. The kind of bite that produces blood loss faster than most people understand is possible. His friends grabbed him immediately. Before they could get him clear, a second strike hit the jet ski hard enough to knock both of them into the water. The shark circled within 10 feet of the disabled machine, unhurried. Marcus never made it off that water. The blood loss from the initial strike was the kind that doesn't leave a window long enough for airlift response times and Gulf distances to work inside. His friend stayed with him and did everything people do when treading water in shock, trying to hold on to someone while something circles nearby. It wasn't enough. The distance between that platform and any meaningful help had always been the deciding factor. They just didn't know it until it became the only factor that mattered. Investigators going through the rental company's records afterward found multiple documented complaints about aggressive shark behavior near that exact platform, filed by previous customers over the preceding months, sitting completely unactioned. The information had arrived. Nothing had been done. The company closed quietly after the inquiry, the kind of response that comes too late to protect anyone and too early to feel like accountability. Marcus went into that water to fix a problem. No performance, no dare, no audience, just a man used to handling things himself, standing waist-deep in the wrong water on a warm August afternoon, doing something completely routine. The machine needed fixing. He fixed things, but his experience couldn't save him that day. Our next victim, however, jumped in for a $20 dare and never came back. It was a May 24th night in 2014, and the Atlantic coast of Florida had that specific quality it gets in late spring after dark. warm and heavy, the kind of air that sits on your skin and doesn't move. The surf loud enough to swallow conversation. The beach lit by nothing except whatever the rental houses threw towards the water. The kind of night that makes people feel like the rules from 12 hours ago are somehow more negotiable now. That feeling would matter more than anyone on that beach understood yet. Trevor Keane was 29 and had spent 6 years bartending in Las Vegas, which is less a job description and more a psychological recalibration. 6 years of late hours, loud rooms, and people at their most unguarded had produced in him a tolerance for chaos that most people never develop. He was the one who said yes first, who moved toward the noise instead of away from it, who had built his entire social identity around the idea that hesitation was just fear wearing a sensible jacket. He wasn't reckless in any clinical sense. He was just someone for whom the gap between a dare and a decision had been compressed over years until it was almost nothing. The beach house had been rented for a bachelor party weekend. By midnight, the group had been drinking for 8 hours. Earlier that evening, lifeguards had posted warning flags along that stretch of shoreline after identifying dense schools of baitfish compressing into the surf zone. The stations had closed for the night. The flags were still there, planted in the sand, visible to anyone who looked. Trevor ran past them on a $20 dare, out past the break, past where his feet left the bottom, to roughly 120 feet from shore, moving through rough currents in the dark like the distance. And the darkness were just part of the dare rather than the most dangerous parts of it. Before this goes further, you need to understand something about bull sharks, because most people picture sharks as deep water creatures, and this story happens in chest-deep surf. Bull sharks are the dominant fatal attack species in Florida's inshore waters, and the reason is architectural. They are built for exactly this environment. They tolerate low salinity, hunt in warm shallows, and are responsible for the majority of unprovoked fatal attacks on this coastline. They do not need deep water. They need darkness, warmth, and prey. When baitfish compress into the surf zone, bull sharks move inshore behind them, not to chase the baitfish, but because a bait concentration is a hunting corridor, and a hunting corridor is an ambush position. A person swimming hard through rough surf at night, struggling, irregular, pushing water, reads as something in distress. Bull sharks have a specific interest in things in distress. The ocean doesn't grade on intention. Witnesses on shore described the first strike as looking like Trevor had dived underwater voluntarily. Those few seconds of confusion, nobody was certain what they were seeing, was the window in which everything changed. A bull shark hit him across the lower abdomen, a committed strike, not a pass. Already locked before either of them knew the other was there, he turned toward shore. That instinct was right, and it wasn't enough. The blood, the struggling movement through rough surf, all of it compounded the situation while the conditions that created it were still fully active. Additional strikes occurred before anyone on the beach could reach him. The Atlantic coast at midnight doesn't leave much room between fast enough and too late, and that night it left none at all. There was no footage. Friends had been watching from the beach, but in the chaos and the dark and the speed of what happened, nothing was captured. What remained was witness accounts, a stretch of shoreline, and the flag still standing in the sand the following morning. Properly posted, protocol followed exactly as it should have been. The system had functioned perfectly. It just hadn't mattered, because the one person it needed to reach had run past it in the dark on a warm May night. Convinced that consequences were something that happened to people who hesitated, Trevor didn't lose his life just because he ignored a warning. He was the kind of person who always said yes when everyone else hesitated, and that identity followed him right into that moment. He didn't believe the warning was meant for him. Our next story is almost the exact opposite. 15 years working around large sharks, following every protocol, never a single serious incident. What happened to her in September 2013 at a Texas Gulf Coast aquarium wasn't about a mistake she made that day. It was about decisions that had been avoided and ignored for years before she ever stepped into that tank. It was September 4th, 2013, and the Texas Gulf Coast in early fall has a particular kind of stillness. The summer heat not quite broken, the air thick and heavy, everything indoors feeling like a relief. Inside a small, private aquarium facility on the coast, the background noise was always mechanical. Filtration systems, pumps running around the clock, and the people who worked there had done the same things in the same order so many times that the work had stopped feeling like decisions. That familiarity was about to matter in a way nobody inside was prepared for. Elena Ruiz was 41, and her path into that facility had taken the long way around. She had started as a commercial diver off the Texas coast, unglamorous, technically demanding work. Oil infrastructure inspection, hull surveys, conditions where the environment doesn't accommodate mistakes. She moved into aquarium maintenance in her early 30s, when a small private facility needed someone with real diving experience rather than just a certification. Her colleagues used one word consistently afterward: methodical. She followed procedure not because she was required to, but because 15 years around large sharks had given her an intimate understanding of what the absence of procedure produced. In 15 years, she had not had a serious incident. That discipline was genuine, and quietly, without anyone noticing, it had also been compensating for years of institutional failures building up around her. On the afternoon in question, a filtration problem had been clouding the water in one of the main enclosures. The protocol was clear: transfer any animals out before sending anyone in for cleanup. Confirm the transfer, then proceed. The sandbar shark had not been transferred. Whether a confirmation step was skipped or someone assumed it had been handled was never established. What was established is that Elena entered the enclosure with a debris bin to clear the floor, not knowing the shark was still inside. Visibility was poor. The water was murky enough that she couldn't clearly see what was moving at her level. Sandbar sharks under open water conditions almost always increase distance from divers, but confined enclosures after feeding periods don't produce open water conditions. A sandbar shark with nowhere to retreat, in cloudy water, in a space it cannot leave, is not the same animal its open water profile describes. When something makes sudden full-body contact in an enclosed space with no exit, it responds the way any large animal responds, immediately and defensively. Elena and the shark met in the cloudy water without either seeing the other coming. The shark bit, not a predatory sequence, but the defensive response of an animal startled at close range with nowhere to go. The bite landed on her shoulder and neck, followed by the shark thrashing hard against the tank wall in panic. The physical damage doesn't pause to consider intentions. Staff moved immediately to the hydraulic access gate. It had documented maintenance issues, filed, noted, and never repaired. Getting it open took longer than any emergency protocol should allow, longer than the situation had room for. When inspectors came through, afterward, they didn't find a single catastrophic failure. They found years, deferred maintenance logs, staff complaints about equipment going unaddressed, a widening gap between what the facility was supposed to be and what it actually was, held together by the professionalism of the people working inside it. Elena's discipline had been quietly absorbing institutional failures for so long that those failures had stopped feeling urgent to the people responsible for fixing them. The facility closed permanently and never reopened. Elena had spent 15 years being the most careful person in every room she walked into. She followed every rule, trusted the system around her, and did everything right. But that September afternoon, none of it mattered. Not because she made a mistake, but because the building itself had been quietly falling apart for years. Our next story is the complete opposite. Noah Grainer didn't lose his life because of a hidden failure around him. He lost it because he ignored the warnings, stopped listening to his guide, and made one careless decision too many. It was June 29th, 2016, and the water off the Baja California coast had that quality the Pacific carries in early summer. Deep blue pushing toward indigo at depth, visibility so clean that 40 feet of water looked like 20. The reef systems out that far haven't been worked over. The fish are bigger, the sharks are bigger, and the distance from any meaningful emergency response feels abstract when you're stepping off a boat into beautiful water, and becomes very concrete when you need it not to be. Noah Granger was 38 and had spent most of his adult life doing things that required other people to acknowledge what he was capable of. Amateur MMA circuits through his late 20s. Enough real contact to build the kind of physical confidence that stops being theoretical and becomes structural. the lens through which he read every situation that followed. When competition stopped being available, he moved into extreme sports: cliff diving, big wave surfing, deep spearfishing, not as a livelihood, but as the organizing fact of who he was. He was not someone who received instructions from a guide he had just met with any openness. That detail is what everything else turns on. The trip was a private spearfishing charter off the Baja Reef. 2 other divers, a small boat, a stretch of reef known for exceptional visibility and serious fish. The guide had one rule: dead fish go on a float line trailing behind the diver, not clipped to the body. The reason requires no expertise. It is the physical difference between the shark going to the fish and the shark going to you. Noah listened. Then he clipped the fish to his waist belt and got in the water. Tiger sharks are among the most dangerous animals in the ocean, and the reason is not speed or aggression in the way most people picture it. It is patience combined with an almost total absence of caution. They are the broadest feeding predators in the sea, eating fish, sea turtles, marine mammals, and anything else the water offers them, which means they approach unfamiliar objects, not with hesitation, but with the assumption that investigation is worth the effort. Around divers, they are bold in a way that experienced underwater photographers describe as uncomfortable, not frantic, but deliberate. They circle, they reduce the radius, they do not lose interest. A diver surfacing repeatedly with bleeding fish pressed against their body is producing the exact combination of signals: scent, erratic movement, disruption at the surface, that a tiger shark is built to treat as opportunity. The shark had been visible to the other divers for a while, working slow loops at depth around the group. Both had already started moving toward the boat. Noah surfaced twice more while they did, the fish on his belt breaking the surface with him each time. The guide had seen the shark and said something. Whether Noah heard it or quietly filed it alongside the float line instruction he had already dismissed, that distinction stopped mattering quickly. The tiger shark came from below and to the side, low and fast and committed. The initial strike knocked Noah backward. The follow-up bite went into his chest and shoulder. The other divers were already on the ladder. They reached back, got hands on him, and pulled him out. He was out. That part worked. The engine developed. Problems afterward. The vessel drifted through the night. Mexican authorities found it the following morning nearly 6 miles from the attack site, gear scattered across the deck. The investigation confirmed that safety protocols had been clearly communicated before anyone entered the water. One diver had chosen not to follow them. The file was closed. Noah had spent nearly 20 years trusting his body to handle whatever came at him, and most of the time, it did. That's what makes confidence dangerous. When things keep working out, you slowly stop thinking about the moment they might not. The next one is harder to explain, because nothing she did was wrong. It was March 5th, 2018, and the Bahamas in early spring has a quality no photograph has ever fully captured. The water shifts from pale glass at the shoreline to aquamarine in the shallows, to something deeper and more serious, where the sandbars drop into tidal channels. Beautiful, clear, and completely indifferent to whoever is standing in it. That gap between appearance and reality was about to matter more than anyone on that sandbar understood. Lily Chen was 22, 2 weeks out of graduation, on a 1-week trip with friends who had been promising themselves this vacation since junior year. She wasn't chasing anything extreme. She had studied fashion design in New York, 4 years built entirely around visual judgment, light, framing, finding the angle that makes an image work. She was good at it. The Bahamas trip was the reward, booked specifically for its visual qualities. The color of that water, the clarity of it, the way morning light moves across a sandbar and turns everything it touches into something worth photographing. She brought a waterproof camera. Of course she did. The tour was a standard shallow water shark encounter package run by a local operator, small boat, isolated sandbar, nurse sharks in knee-deep water. Photogenic, manageable, safe enough to market to tourists who had never been near a shark in their lives. The group feeding session proceeded exactly as advertised. The water was clear, the sharks behaved predictably, and Lily's camera had been running from the moment she stepped off the boat. What nobody in that group understood, and what the operator had never made clear, was what 3 years of repeated feeding sessions at that specific sandbar had done to the surrounding environment. When a feeding operation runs at the same fixed location for years, the local shark population learns. The sandbar becomes associated with food. The presence of a boat, people in the water, activity in the shallows, all of it becomes a conditioned signal. But the animals drawn in aren't only the nurse sharks performing for cameras in knee-deep water. Bull sharks patrol the tidal channels that cut through sandbars like this one. Channels that are invisible from the surface, indistinguishable from the shallow water on either side. They are territorial, site-associative, and acutely sensitive to the chemical signals a feeding session produces. 3 years of bait in the water at the same location means 3 years of bull sharks learning that this sandbar is worth investigating. A person standing at the edge of a channel, drop-off in water, that has been a conditioned feeding site is producing stimuli that nothing in that animal's experience has taught it to treat with caution. Before this goes further, you need to understand what bull sharks actually are, because the name suggests something less serious than the reality. Bull sharks are the most dangerous large shark in inshore tropical water, and the reason is not temperament in any simple sense. It is habitat overlap. They are the only species that moves freely between saltwater and freshwater, that hunts actively in knee-deep tidal channels, that tolerates the warm, murky, sandbar-cut shallows where people wade. When other dangerous species stay offshore, bull sharks are already in the channel beneath your feet. They are heavy-bodied, short-snouted, and they hit hard. A bite from a large bull shark to the upper leg is not a warning or an investigation. It is a structural event. The femoral artery runs through the inner thigh, and a bite that reaches it turns the surrounding water into a clock. The operator had been running sessions there for over 3 years. No certification, no safety protocols, no system governing where guests could go once the structured session ended. After the group session finished, most guests returned to the boat. Lily walked the other direction, toward the section where the light was cleaner and the frame was emptier. The channels cut through the sandbar around her, invisible from the surface. The water above them looked exactly like the water everywhere else, clear, shallow, calm. She had no way of knowing they were there. Nobody had told her to look. The strike came from the channel edge without warning. A single bull shark, fast and fully committed, hitting Lily's upper right thigh where the sandbar shelf dropped away. The force of it knocked her sideways into the channel drop-off. The water there was only chest-deep on the sandbar side, but the channel itself ran deeper, and the current moving through it was stronger than anything visible from the surface. Witnesses on the sandbar saw her go down and lose her footing. She didn't come back up cleanly. The combination of the bite, the current pulling through the channel, and the blood loss already beginning was more than one person in shock could fight through alone. And the people who might have reached her couldn't get to her in time. The boat wouldn't start. The anchor rope had fouled in the propeller during the feeding session. The group could do nothing except wait for a rescue vessel coming from a distance. By the time it arrived, the tide had moved in. Footprints along the sand were gone. Lily's camera had scattered into the current. What remained on the surface, a few drifting bait buckets, a half-submerged selfie stick, was already heading toward open water. The investigation found what it was always going to find: an operator running commercial shark feeding tours at the same sandbar for over 3 years with no certification, no safety infrastructure, and no protocols for where guests could go once the tour concluded. The operation was closed. Lily walked toward a better angle. That was the whole of it. No recklessness, no boundary pushing, no decision that would have looked wrong to anyone watching her make it. Just a 22-year-old with a good eye and a waterproof camera moving toward the light, stepping into water that looked exactly like all the other water around her and was not.